Okay, that's it. All right, thanks, Pratik. So, yeah, my name is TJ Van Tol, and I'm actually here all the way from Lansing, Michigan, where it's a heck of a lot colder than it is here. Uh, we had about a foot of snow actually on the ground when I left, and it's been like 12 degrees high, so I'm pretty sure none of that has went anywhere while I was gone. But so I'm here. I flew in for DevNexus, and then Pratik asked me to give a talk. Um, my Twitter handle is TJ Van Tol, and I'll be tweeting out the links to these slides afterwards, and also put them on the meetup. So if you don't want to worry about taking notes or anything. So work as a developer advocate for Telerik. How many people here have heard of us? Heard of Telerik? Okay, a couple people. So we kind of got our start in the .NET world, and then we've been branching more into the mobile and web space. And if we make Kendo UI, if you've heard of us before, and I have 3 very coveted Kendo UI stress balls here that you can come see me about after this talk. And and then I'm also on the jQuery team. I work on a few of the different jQuery projects, and I focus mostly on jQuery UI. So if you want to talk about Telerik or anything jQuery after this talk, feel free to come grab me. But the main topic of this talk is about form validation, which I actually kind of like this topic. This is probably one of the least sexy topics that you can ever talk about. This isn't something you see at a whole lot of conferences, but this is actually something really practical. So how many people in this room have done form validation before, written form validation code? Right. So most of the hands in the room goes up, and like unlike a lot of these more trendy topics, this is something that I think you can actually take back to your work and actually apply today. Now, I guess another question is, how many people have enjoyed writing form validation before? So there is one person who has enjoyed writing form validation before. It's really one of those things that you just feel like you have to do, and you're like, oh man, I have to actually validate this form, because it's a complete pain. And it seems like by now we should have a better way of doing this. And this is one of the things that the HTML5 specification actually tries to address. Now, if you were to actually look this up in the spec, the term you would see is the word constraint validation, which probably doesn't mean a whole lot. It's just the term that the spec actually uses to describe the tech behind this. And what it actually is an algorithm that the browser runs when the user attempts to submit a form. And it makes for great nighttime reading if you want to take this link later tonight and read through it. But it's actually not that hard to understand, and we'll go through some of the big parts of this today. Now, when I talk about form validation, basically the forms that we're writing today look a little something like this. This is pretty much the most basic form that you can write, just a text box and a button. And if I take this form, and the browser is not going to do anything to prevent me from submitting this form. So I can provide a value like that, but I can also provide just nothing in this form, and the browser is not going to stop that value at all. Now, what we're doing today, whether you're writing this code yourself or you're using a library that kind of abstracts you from this, is you'll say, okay, I need to get a reference to my form, and then, okay, I need to listen for the submit event to happen. And then when that event happens, I have to do whatever I need to do to manually check the data in my field. So in this case, it's like, okay, well, if my input's value is empty, okay, well, that's a required field. So then you have to manually prevent the form submission from happening. And then after you do that, you want to give the user some feedback. So you somehow make something blink or red or fly across the screen or whatever to tell the user that there's some problem. And this code isn't really all that bad. I mean, there's a few lines of code here. It's a little bit clunky, but this gets a little out of control when you start to get into real-world complex forms, when you start to have date validation and numbers and multiple fields and fields across an app. This quickly gets out of control. So to show the most basic example of form validation in HTML5, I guess the easiest one to show is just the required attribute. This is the exact same form as before, but now with this field being required, the browser is actually automatically going to prevent this form from being submitted and provide this little tooltip bubble automatically. And there's no actual JavaScript magic going on behind the scenes here. This code will actually work without JavaScript enabled at all, which is a heck of a lot easier than having to do this nonsense. Now, the next question that usually comes up is, well, can I actually use this? And support for constraint validation is actually really good. IE shipped full support in IE10. Firefox and Chrome have had it for a while. Chrome for Android has had it for a while. Now, the big problems on these charts, there's 3 columns here. There's Safari right here, iOS Safari, and the default Android browser. And there's actually kind of a funny story here. When constraint validation actually got implemented in the WebKit source code, it was done, Chrome actually put it in there years ago before they forked into Blink. And because of that, the code to handle all this constraint validation stuff is actually in all these browsers. Safari actually has a constraint validation implementation, so does iOS Safari, and so does the default Android browser. They're just turned off. So all the APIs that we're going to talk about today, they're actually in these browsers. Those browsers just won't prevent forms from being submitted automatically, which is really weird, and it's really hard to explain. But I'll show it in examples as we go through this. And we'll kind of talk about some ways to actually deal with this if you want to use these technologies in your app. Now, I'm going to talk about these things today. When I talk about constraint validation, it's usually broken into 3 segments. There's some new HTML attributes like required. There's a full DOM API behind this, and then there's also some CSS hooks that you can use. So we'll talk about each of those, and then we'll kind of take a step back and talk about what can you actually take back and actually deploy to production with this stuff. Now, the form elements, this is actually, in my opinion, the best part of the spec. This was really well designed because a lot of these these attributes just kind of make sense. They're pretty semantic. For example, min and max, if you have a number input, the browser will automatically enforce these values. For example, I have a min of 2 here, and so if I provide a min of 1, the browser will prevent it and give me a little message there. Same thing if I go above the max. And it applies for more than number types as well. I can switch this to a date input. Let's say I want to force the user to pick a date in March sometime. Now Chrome actually does something kind of cool and interesting here in that they automatically prevent me from doing anything with the month and the year. So in that case, the validation is kind of implicit. The user is actually prevented from specifying that value at all. And even in their little calendar widget, and let's see how the contrast does here, but you can see that it actually enforced in the calendar the dates that the user could pick.
Is the switches up top disabled too?
Yes, yeah. Well, so you can click that, but then you can't actually change the month. Only March is enabled. Min and max. Max length. Max length is the only attribute that was actually in HTML4, and it's another one that's kind of implicit because basically I'm typing like mad, and the browser is actually going to stop me at 2 characters. There's one kind of weird provision in the spec that I'm not actually going to read out that says if the value is greater than the max length, so the starting value, then that's actually fine. But if you do this and the user makes a change to the field, that's the only very rare situation that you can get this bubble, which shouldn't ever actually happen, but it is possible to get the bubble with max length. But most of the time, it's something that the browser will actually prevent this situation from ever happening in the first place.
Is that just Chrome for that?
It's all browsers. That's actually, this wording in the spec actually lays that out. It says, basically, if the value is longer than its max length, and its dirty flag is true, which means the user actually did something with the field, and that's the only time it's actually eligible for constraint validation. So let's see, max length. Pattern's the most powerful of these attributes because it just basically lets you provide an arbitrary regex to match against the user's input. In this case, I'm providing something kind of like a currency value. If I provide gibberish, Chrome's going to step in this case and tell me that I'm not matching the format that's requested. But if I go back and actually provide a value it likes, it'll let that go. Now, you might have noticed, well, that little bubble wasn't actually all that helpful. I mean, please match the requested format didn't really tell the user what format you actually needed. And that's because in this case, the browser's usually pretty good about being able to figure out these messages. But in the case of pattern, like, who knows? You can just provide any regex in there. So the spec actually has a special thing for this that specifically for pattern mismatches, you can provide a title attribute to provide some kind of supplemental information. So if I go back here and I create a problem again, most browsers, Chrome implements it like this. All browsers do something similar where they kind of use that same message but then provide the title attribute underneath of it. Now Chrome actually has a little quirk. The one browser difference here is that Chrome will actually show the title attribute for any constraint validation issue. So for instance, if I change this field to be required instead, Chrome will show the title attribute in this as well. And this is something that I actually prefer Chrome's behavior here because I find the ability to provide a title attribute kind of handy, because sometimes just simply telling somebody that something's required, you might have to tell them why it's required. But unfortunately, in the spec itself, it only dictates that the user agent or the browser has to do it for a pattern mismatch and not the others. And I've actually tried to figure out why that is to get some consistency, and I haven't actually heard back from the people on the spec yet. But for now, just in case you happen to test this only in Chrome, that is actually Chrome-specific behavior. And we'll talk more about how to change the actual messages and those bubbles later on. So because these patterns are so powerful, there's a couple people that have created sites to kind of aggregate these different patterns that you can use. HTML5 pattern is probably the most common of these that list out, different like postal codes, phones, dates, these type things. But I do want to caution you against using these, because here's one I picked off that site. So who wants to tell me what this does? Anybody?
Is it Social Security? 42.
No, it is not. It's not 42, not Social Security. This is actually date validation. And this is actually crazy. It's pretty impressive because, yeah, like there's the century right up there. So this will break in 2100. But it actually it'll do validation for the number of days in a month. But it also catches leap years as well, which I think is crazy. So for instance, if I type in this year, oops, I needed the 20, let's see. Let's see, so if I provide garbage here, it knows that that's not valid. Let's see, September knows that that's not valid, but then once I switch, it'll let it know that that's the case. But I show this to make the case that obviously I would not want to be the person who is maintaining someone who committed this code. So even though the pattern gives you great power, use it responsibly. What's that?
That's awesome.
Yeah, that site is pretty cool just to peruse some of the various things you can do with just random regex. It's pretty sweet. The required attribute, I showed this before with text boxes. I just wanted to briefly show that it works on any form element. So there's text boxes, but you can also apply it to checkboxes. Say you have like a terms of use checkbox. You can do radio buttons if you want to make sure the user picks one option or the other. You can do it on select boxes. And you can also do it on text areas. So it's not specific to inputs at all. And okay, so step attribute is the next one. And this is most commonly used with numbers. So if I hit up and down on the keyboard, it's going to tell me to step by 2. But then the browser will also enforce that if I go against this, it'll tell me that it's not good and what the nearest closest values are. You can also use step for dates. And this one kind of boggles my mind why anybody would care about it. But if you provide a step 2 of dates, it gives you this checkerboard calendar. I really don't know what the use case for this is, but you can actually do that. And then the last of these attributes is type. And type is basically syntax sugar for different patterns. So for instance, you can tell the browser this must be a valid email address, and it's going to automatically validate that the user provides a valid one. Same thing with URL. Now there's one little quirk with URL. Does anybody catch what the problem is here? No. It's the protocol. Browser doesn't like it, or the actual specs dictates that the URL must be a fully qualified URL complete with the protocol.
Just out of curiosity, does it allow a import specification?
I don't know. I think it would, but back before Opera switched from Presto to Blink, they actually had some code in there that would add the protocol on blur. It would just assume it was HTTP, which I thought was kind of a nifty little feature, but that kind of died when Presto died. So I bring this up because if you end up using a type URL, it's probably a good idea to provide some sort of hint to the user that, because I think a lot of people just don't think that they would need to add the protocol to the URL. Yeah, something like a placeholder would probably be good. And type date is the same thing. This is kind of like the better way of implementing that crazy pattern that we showed before. And it'll do all the same validation, days in the month, leap year, things like that. Those are all the attributes that you can apply to actual form elements. There's also a few that go on different attributes on the page. There's a no validate attribute that you can put on forms that is, again, a pretty self-explanatory one. It just says, don't run any of this validation stuff, just let the submit go. So this field here is required, but because I have the no validate attribute, it's actually going to let the submission go. There's a form no validate attribute that you can put on submit buttons. This is another one that I really have no idea why you would ever use this, because I can't think of a reason why you'd want to have two different buttons, one that does validation and one that doesn't. But just in case you run across that situation, this, yeah, I guess testing it could work. But so validate and then do not validate as well. I would say testing, but there's already no validate that you could put on the form as well, which seems like it could be easier. Oh. But yeah, but you'd expect a cancel button to like reset the form and not necessarily submit it, because it's only for submit buttons. So, but it exists. And those are all the HTML attributes. I think that was a spec that was actually pretty well designed. Like most of those things are pretty self-explanatory, and I think they did a pretty good job with that. But we're going to talk about the DOM API next, which is kind of a different story. The DOM API, if you were to actually look this up, Google it, is known as the Constraint Validation API. And what it actually is a series of properties and methods that are now on DOM elements. And we'll go through each of them briefly. The first one is will validate, which just tells you whether a field, a given element is eligible for constraint validation, whether it'll be subject to form validation. And for instance, like a div here, it's not even going to have this property because a div can never actually be validated. This text box here, will validate, will be true on that because it has no special constraints here. It's just wide open. The user can put whatever. And this this field with a disabled attribute, will validate, is actually false because disabled fields don't submit. Therefore, they're not validated either.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Does assume that you're inside a form tag?
What's that? Oh. I think those properties will be true even if they're not in a form.
But it won't validate anyway.
Yeah, it won't technically submit if it's not in a form. So yeah, you need a form for any of this to actually work. I think this is just removed just for simplicity of this example. I did want to bring up one point related to this, and that's to be careful with using hidden fields. And you might think, well, why would you ever hide a form field? Well, say you have say like a drop-down or radio button that determines whether one part of a page shows or another. Say the user has to pick between check and credit card, and when you pick check, well, you don't need to. You can just hide the credit card section. Well, if I do that here, say I hide this required field here, and I actually do the submit, I actually get a JavaScript error because the browser, that field will still submit to the browser even though it's hidden, or it will submit to the server even though it's hidden. So the browser will actually still validate against it, and then when it determines it can't actually give the thing focus because it's not actually there, it'll actually throw a JavaScript error and the form won't submit. So basically the best practice is when you hide the fields, disable them as well. And oops, say bold. And when you do that, the browser will ignore it because that field won't actually go down to the server. The next property is validity. And it's an object with basically a grab bag of properties that more or less correspond one-to-one to the attributes we looked at earlier. For instance, the value missing property will be true if a field is required and the user didn't, and the value is currently empty. Type mismatch, if you say type equals number and there's letters in there, type mismatch will be true, that sort of thing. Valid is kind of an aggregation of all these things. And so really if any of these are true, then you can always check validity.valid to see if the field is currently valid. The validation message is the next one. This property shows you what actually shows in the bubble. So it'll expose the browser's message for you. This gets into where this API is a little weird, because you would think that, oh, if I just want to change that message, well, I'll just change the validation message. But it actually just does nothing. If you change the validation message, it doesn't error, but it doesn't do anything either. I have in some of the default messages, and I include Safari here because, interestingly enough, like I said earlier, Safari, even though it has constraint validation turned off, it still has the implementation, so it still has a valid validation message filled out for these fields. The next, so then we'll go into the methods. The first of these is check validity, which it's kind of straightforward, but you can call it on individual form elements or on a form itself. So if I call it on this first field here, which is required, check validity is going to return false because this is a required field with no value. Here, if I call it on the next field, this will return true because this input has no constraints, so it's currently valid. But then I can also call it on a form if I want a quick check to see if that form as a whole contains valid data or not.
How's that different from the one you showed a couple slides ago that's dot valid, whatever?
Oh, the validity.valid?
Yeah.
It'll also, I'll get into that in a minute, it also fires an invalid event if you go through check validity, and that's the only difference. There's one weird thing with check validity. You would expect when you run this to basically run the full validation process to see the bubbles and such again, but it actually doesn't do that. It just reports the validity. It doesn't run through the full validation logic. And that's kind of something that people expect to be available. There's really no method that you can do right now to say, run that submission process. It's not actually possible. Just kind of a major oversight of this entire spec. But report validity was recently added to the specification that it works exactly like check validity, but it runs through the full process. So it'll actually move focus to the first invalid field. It'll show the bubble for that field, whereas check validity doesn't currently do that. But unfortunately, no browsers actually have this implemented yet. The next method, and this is to me the most confusing part of all of this set custom validity method, because it violates a very basic API practice in that it's an API that does two things. So the first thing it does that's a little more straightforward is it sets the validation message. So it controls what actually shows in the bubble. If you call set custom validity here, I'm calling it with custom error message. Then if I go to submit this form, you can see that I actually changed the message in this bubble. I now see custom error message. However, you'll also notice that this input here has no special constraints on it. There's no reason the browser should prevent this. By calling set custom validity with anything other than an empty string, you're also telling the browser that that is an invalid field, which is kind of weird to wrap your head around. But because I called set custom validity, I actually now cannot submit this form because I told the browser that that field is actually invalid. And to clear it, interestingly enough, I have to call set custom validity again, naturally with an empty string. And the browser actually likes that. And this to me is really strange, but this is actually the only way that you can control the messages in the bubble is to go through this API. And I think the most practical, or I shouldn't say practical, the most common application of this is the password field criteria, right? You want to have two password fields, user has to type the same in both. So the code to actually do this, what I'm doing here is I'm getting a reference to each of these fields, and that I set a change event listener on each of these fields, saying that when either of these fields change, I check whether their values are equal, and if they are equal, I call set custom validity with an empty string, telling the browser that these fields are valid, or in this case, password 1 is valid. And if they're not equal, then I call set custom validity in the first field to say, okay, well, the passwords must match. Then when I actually do this and type some mess in here, and the browser will prevent this, saying the passwords must match. And then if I go back and put the same value in each, the browser will actually like this. But I mean, in my opinion, this is unfortunately clunky to do something that seems like it should be pretty straightforward. It's kind of a weird, convoluted way of doing it. But at the same time, I don't think it's nearly as bad as some of the JavaScript we had to write before to do this sort of thing.
That would actually validate an empty password.
Yeah, because the fields are also required.
Oh, required.
Yep. The last part of this is the invalid event, which is what you were getting at earlier. There's two ways that the invalid event is fired. The first is by calling the check validity method that we looked at before. Now I have this here just kind of to show the flow, because this invalid text isn't in the source by default, but when I call check validity, it'll actually fire this invalid event, which all these 2 lines of code are doing is just spitting out invalid just to show that check validity actually fires this event. The more common way that the invalid event is fired is when you go to submit a form, the browser, as part of that big algorithm that we looked at earlier, it'll say for each field that is invalid, when a potential submission occurs, fire an invalid event for each of those form elements. So here, I have a field that's required, and when I attempt to submit it, the browser is going to fire an invalid event on this input, which will trigger this listener and then spit out that text. And I can do that multiple times to see it over and over again. And to quickly show that it'll do it on multiple fields, I have 2 required fields here. And all I'm doing here is attaching an invalid event to both that just changes their background to red. And you can see that it actually triggers for each of these events. Now, it seems like that would be all that you need to implement any sort of form validation thing, but this is actually kind of limiting. And I wanted to show an example of this. So this is a pretty common criteria for form validation, that you have a form and you just want to show a grouped thing of messages at the top of the screen. And it seems like this really shouldn't be that hard to implement, but it unfortunately is. And there's a couple reasons for that. The first is when you implement something like this, you have no way of knowing when you actually need to clear that list, because there is no, at the moment, there is no invalid event on the form. You just get it on individual fields. So you don't know in an individual invalid event whether what is going on, whether that was the time that the user attempted to submit a form. You have no way of knowing when an attempted submit occurs. And part of the reason for that is that, so that submit event we looked at on like the second slide here, the way we're doing form validation now, the browser doesn't actually fire that submit event until it has deemed the form valid. So basically, whenever you see a bubble, that means a submit event never actually occurred. Submit is the very end of the process. So to implement something like this right now, you have to do some very manual checking. And that's what this code here does. It basically says, for each of the submit buttons, when they're clicked, then run some logic to show all these error messages. And then also, since you can also submit a form using enter key presses in a form field, also listen for enter to be pressed and run that logic as well. Which essentially, this is the same code. I mean, this is what a submit event does for you. But since the submit event won't fire, you have to do all of this manually. Now, the code to actually show the messages isn't really that hard. Basically, it just says find all elements that match the invalid pseudo class, which we'll look at in a minute when we look at the CSS stuff. And then grab the validation message and then just spit it out in a list on the top of the screen. So that part isn't bad. This part where you just have to manually listen for submission is currently a little bit clunky to do. Now, the last bit of code is a workaround for those WebKit-based browsers that have the implementation but don't have it turned on. Because interestingly enough, those browsers, they will fire that submit event because they don't prevent anything. So you'll get this submit event. And then in it, since you actually have the APIs, Safari, iOS, they all have these APIs available, you can use the constraint validation APIs to check whether the form is valid. And if it is, just run the same logic up here to show the error messages, and then just focus the first invalid field. And this is really all you need to do to kind of polyfill this behavior for those browsers. But it's still a mess. I mean, ideally, you would just have to write this code to build the error messages on the top of the screen, and you wouldn't have to do these 2 workarounds. But that's unfortunately the situation that we have today. And I wrote, you can follow this link later if you want. I wrote up something that's a little more comprehensive talking about what I did in that example there. Now, luckily, this is actually, I was pretty proud of this. This was my first ever contribution to the HTML spec. So I complained about this on an article I wrote a while ago, and somebody on the spec actually told me, like, well, why don't you actually file a spec issue for it? Maybe we can get it fixed. And, okay. So I did, and it actually got changed. So the spec actually now dictates that there should be an invalid event fired on forms every time the user attempts to submit a form and it contains invalid data. And this was updated maybe 6 months ago, something like that. But unfortunately, no browser has actually implemented this. But someday that those workarounds will be able to be ripped out, which I think is pretty cool. And so that's the full DOM API. Like I said, I think the DOM stuff is a little bit clunkier. You have to do some workarounds, but I still think that even those workarounds aren't as bad compared to some of the JavaScript mess that we're writing today. And the last part we're going to look at is the CSS hooks. And there's only a few of these, and these are also ones that are pretty straightforward, that you don't need a whole lot of explanation for these. Required and optional, obviously this field that's required here matches the required pseudo class, so I'm giving it a red background. The field that is not required would be optional. It matches the optional pseudo class here, which gets a background of blue. There's valid and invalid, which are also pretty self-explanatory. So these fields are both required. The one that has the value will match the valid pseudo class, and the one that does not matches the invalid pseudo class. Now, interestingly, these are live, so if I change these values, they'll automatically update, I mean, even on the key press. Just one note on this, that actually the spec dictates that valid and invalid, in addition to applying to individual form elements, also apply to the form itself. So I have a form here, and I'm applying styles here to the valid and invalid pseudo class of this form, but you can see that Chrome actually does nothing with this. There's no changes. But if I go over to Firefox and load this exact same example, you can see that it actually does render this pseudo class. And I only bring this up because you want to be careful about applying global rules to valid and invalid, especially if you're only testing in Chrome. This is one of those things that can bite you randomly. And kind of along the same lines, IE and Firefox actually have some default styling for invalid fields that are just baked into the user agent styles. So if you want to provide your own styling for invalid fields, you might want to reset this. Firefox uses a box shadow, IE uses an outline. Now, there's one problem with valid and invalid that we didn't really talk about, but if you look back at this example, you can see that these fields were automatically matched these pseudo classes immediately on page load. And UX studies show that this is actually a very bad thing, that users actually get disoriented if they come to a page and automatically they see errors. They're like, what? That's kind of crazy. So Firefox actually tackled this problem way back in, I think version 6. And they came up with these pseudo classes Moz UI valid and Moz UI invalid. So if I switch back over to Firefox here, you can see that I'm using, this is basically the same example, except this time I'm using the Moz UI valid and Moz UI invalid class. And you can see that on page load, these fields aren't styled at all. But there's two ways I can get them to. One is if I actually blur a field, it'll apply the field after that. So basically the user has interacted with the field. And the other way is if you attempt a form submission, it'll apply it there as well. And so they actually did quite a bit of research into this and found what were the UX best practices to applying these and applied them to these pseudo classes. And luckily enough, that actually made it into the spec. So the selector's level 4 spec contains user error, which is more or less an exact equivalent of Moz UI invalid. Now, I'm not exactly sure why the equivalent, the Moz UI valid, didn't make it into the spec, but I think the invalid one is by far the more common use case, and it's more problematic. That's the thing that really messes with users. So I did want to show a quick example of if you want to work around this, if you want to use invalid and valid in a more UX-friendly way, how you could do that. So you can see this is in Chrome, and these fields are both required again. And basically, these stylings, I'll show one valid and one invalid, don't apply until after I've done something with this element. So to actually implement this, basically I have to do the same thing where I listen for submissions again, but this time I do something different in the actual implementation. I'm just adding a class of interacted, just manually adding a class name. And I do the same thing to each form element on blur. Just add an interactive class name, and then I preface all of my CSS rules with that class name to make sure that the user has actually done something with these fields before I apply these rules. Which is, again, one of those things that's a bit clunky, but it's a known problem and something that we should have a better solution for in the future. The last one is bubbles, and having actually implemented this, I can tell you that, are there any designers in the room? What do you think of these bubbles?
Too varied across.
I need to style.
Yeah. Well, that's actually the comment that I get most often. Like little things like that, like especially because you might like one or two of them, but like if you have a certain color scheme that you like, this might just be a total disaster for you. And so basically the question is, well, how do you style these bubbles? And I have bad news. You actually can't. There's nothing you can do to change the look of these bubbles. And WebKit, when this was actually implemented by the Google people in WebKit, they actually had some pseudo elements that you could do some tinkering with this. So you used to be able to do, I mean, silly things like this, but you could also do like little things like just change the colors to maybe match your site's color scheme or whatever. But they actually ripped that out in Chrome 28. They changed the way that they build these bubbles to fix a bunch of bugs, and with it, those pseudo elements went away with those. So I'm sad to report that you basically just have to take what you get for the bubbles. You don't really have a whole lot of control over it. I will say that using the bubbles is kind of nice, especially when you think about mobile devices, because anybody who's tried to like position those things on like a tablet and a phone and a desktop browser knows that it's a complete pain in the ass, and have to worry about like, well, on certain screen sizes and depending on where fields are. And it's really kind of liberating to let the browser actually deal with that for you, so you just completely don't have to care about it. But it is kind of unfortunate that you can't even change little things like the font and the colors and things like that. And unfortunately, I know of no plans for any browsers to actually implement, to actually give you hooks into these sort of things. But one thing you can do is you can actually turn the bubbles off. So that same invalid event that we looked at before, if you prevent the default action with it, the bubble won't show up. So here I have a required field again, but if I try to submit, you can see that the browser is preventing the submission, but I get no bubble. Now, obviously, of course, if you go this route, you will want to do something, show the user some sort of error message. But you can get the benefits of the APIs and such, but then still have the ability to implement kind of your own UI for this sort of thing. And that's really it. There's not a whole lot to constraint validation, and most of it, I think, is fairly straightforward. There's a few kinks, but there's some ways to work around this that, in my opinion, aren't too bad. But the last thing I want to talk about is what it actually makes sense for you to use. Like, can you actually go and put this in your app right now? And of course, the problem is, well, if you're supporting IE less than 9 and below, there's no implementation of constraint validation at all. And we kind of looked at some workarounds for Safari and iOS Safari, but that's still even a little clunky. And so I'll offer 3 different options if you want to use this today. The first is just to fall back to server-side validation. The second is to use a polyfill. And then the last option is to use just a library, which is similar to what you probably are doing today. So I want to talk about each of these briefly. Now, the first one I want to talk about is server-side validation. Now, I guess it kind of has to go without being said, but all of these things that we're talking about, all these client-side validation niceties, are still no substitute for server-side validation. I mean, I'm guessing lots of people in this room could tell me how to get around a field being required using the dev tools. And it's not even that. HTTP requests don't even actually have to come from the browser. You can send them from curl or any other number of ways to send requests. So none of this is a replacement for doing validation on the server. It's something that you still need to do. And when you think of it that way, any of this client-side validation stuff we do is really progressive enhancement to the user experience. I mean, that's why we do any of this, to make our forms easier to use for the users, easier to figure out, faster for them to complete the form. But unfortunately, really, client-side validation is duplicate effort. It really kind of validates the dry principle of software development. You are putting your rules in 2 different places. So when I say the option to keep using this, or to use constraint validation today, really what I'm talking about is, since you already have to have this server-side validation in place, if you just rig up some mechanism to get reasonable error messages back from the server, that can be your fallback. So you can just let browsers that don't have support just go ahead and submit that form and just come back with error messages to show them. And so I came up with a quick demonstration of this. So I have a little thing to do server-side validation, and in Chrome, I'm using constraint validation, so the browser native validation will stop me. But I'm not doing any sort of crazy hacks or anything, so if I switch over to Safari here, what I'm doing is I just go back to the server, and I'll bring up the actual example here. So I'm just using a very basic PHP example just to show kind of how this works. And so I'm making a post to do.php, and which is an extremely simple example where I just say, is this field empty? Then just return some sort of nice error message. And then when I get back from the submission, all I do is say, okay, well, loop over them and just show them on the screen. And kind of right there is my fallback, because I mean that code will work back to IE6 because it doesn't have the constraint validation stuff, but the basic postback server model has been in place since the beginning of the web.
Is there a reason you wouldn't use the same rendering mechanism on both the client and the server?
The same rendering mechanism?
Right, so like those errors that you were showing, was there a reason that you couldn't do that with the client also?
To show them here? Well, that's kind of the example I showed earlier with like building a list of error messages using the API.
If you go in Chrome and use this and then you switch browsers, you get a different experience.
You get a different experience, yeah, depending on whether the... I mean, you could use something like, say, the no validate attribute, which basically puts control back in your hands. That you can turn, or you could turn off the bubbles if you wanted to do that sort of thing. So it kind of depends on which approach you want to take, if that makes sense. So like you can build an experience that's consistent for everyone, but if you want to kind of use the APIs where it's available, then you're going to have a slightly different experience across browsers.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I think there might be a reason because people expect certain ways from one browser versus another browser.
Yeah, but I guess it depends. I mean, how many users in the real world will use your app on multiple different devices or multiple different screens? I mean, some people will, but I think it's mostly a developer concerned that like we'll do that. Like we'll totally bust out the site in like 8 different, all of our new toys and devices. But I don't know if a real world user would necessarily hit it from. Yeah, exactly.
And so if you change the error messages, they're gonna be taken back because it's not what they're expecting.
Yeah. Well, and that's a consideration, and so there's 2 more options left that I'm going to show for options, so that'll provide more of a consistent experience. So to switch back here, so the next option would be to just polyfill these APIs to make them available in browsers that don't have them. And I'm going to bring up 2 different options. There's more out here, but these are kind of, in my opinion, the 2 most popular ones out there. One is known as H5F, which this one I kind of like because it's pretty lightweight. It doesn't try to do too much. So it's a polyfill in the sense that, again, in the same sense, in Chrome it's just going to use the native validation. There's nothing to do because Chrome supports all of these APIs. But if I switch back over to Safari, you can say it kind of rigs up its own way of handling these things, its own bubble mechanism, its own way of highlighting these fields to kind of make up for the fact that Safari doesn't have support natively out of the box. And the other one I wanted to show is a bit more of a fully featured one. It's called Web Shims.
On the consistency issue, I mean, you already showed that they weren't consistent anyway, right? So
well, yeah, even if you use this, I mean,
even
if you use the constraint validation, you're going to have different looking bubbles, yes. So let's see. Again, Web Shims, this is a polyfill, so that means in Chrome, basically I just have the status quo. And I said Web Shims is more fully featured, and we'll see it when we look at this in Safari, because not only does it do the same validation thing, but Web Shims actually has implementations for the bubbles, which work kind of like the browsers, but it'll even go as far as like polyfilling input type date and number, and it kind of goes crazy, which if you're looking for something that's more fully featured and it's going to ramp up your experience for everyone, that might be for you, but it's also a little bit of a heavier option as well. But I wanted to present it as an option. And so the last option I'm going to bring up is just using a library that's based off HTML5. And when I say based off HTML5, I mean you can basically keep your markup like you already have it, so use things like the required attribute and the pattern attribute, but then just let a library kind of fully take over for you. And I guess what I mean by that is, I guess I'll show 2 specific examples. The first is the jQuery validation plugin. How many people here have used the jQuery validation plugin? A couple of people. Okay. I'll show a demo here. Now, this is a library that actually will build a consistent experience for all devices. And what it actually does under the hood is it'll take this form and it'll actually apply that no validate attribute that we looked at earlier, because basically it wants to take full control. And these JavaScript libraries like this, so if I bring this up, so this is the example that was running. You can see that I was able to keep my markup the same. So I'm still using the required attributes for these, and like it'll also look for things like type equals email. It'll polyfill that validation as well. And it's really only a matter of just calling a validate plugin on the form, and it has dozens of options that you could look over for more custom behavior. I have in here an example of how you might customize the messages. If you wanted, for instance, a different message for the name, you don't have to go through the clunky DOM APIs. You could use something like this instead. And let's see, back to here. The other option, so disclaimer, like I said, I work for Telerik, but Kendo UI actually has a form validation mechanism as well. And if we switch over to this demo, you can see that this example is actually going to work quite similarly. Kendo UI has full things to do tooltips. There's plenty of other ways that you can customize this. But under the hoods, the code is pretty similar. Basically, I have the same basic markup. Kendo UI has one additional thing where you can do validation messages as attributes. And Firefox, I didn't mention this earlier, but Firefox had some proprietary pseudo attribute like Moz validation message, something like that, that you could provide as an attribute. Okay. But they actually, it's still in Firefox, but no other browser. They tried to get that as part of the spec. The consensus from the spec was that attributes there's too many variations, right? Because you could have a field that was invalid for 5 or 6 potential reasons, especially when you're talking like min, max, step, that sort of thing. So it got axed from the spec, but Kendo UI still provides an implementation of this, just in case. And I think it's actually kind of convenient for a lot of times, because lots of times you just have one reason the field could be invalid. And you can also break it into things like different reasons to being invalid, things like if it's required or email, things like that. So that's really it. Basically, like I said, the 3 options, if you actually want to use this stuff, if you want to take it back and deploy it into production. And I would actually kind of encourage you to do it. I've done it on real apps, and it's actually worked out pretty well. It can help with development. The first option, basically, use a server-side validation. Just come up with some means of giving back nice error messages from the server and displaying them on the screen. The second one would be use a polyfill. So in browsers that have support, the polyfill just will do nothing. But in browsers that don't have support, it'll do a little something to make these APIs available. And the last option would be to just use a library like the jQuery validation plugin, like Kendo UI's validator, and that'll build that consistent experience across browsers, but you're giving up some of the native functionality to actually do that. So that's all I have. As a shameless plug, I am also, since I'm on the jQuery team, I'm also writing a book on jQuery UI. So if you're interested, let me know. But that's really all I have.